Yes, I am Jay Cheel. I'm the writer and director of Cursed Films and Cursed Films 2.
So congrats on Cursed Films 2. I believe that the first episode will be out on Shudder today for everyone to view. How does it feel reaching the finish line for a second time?
Uh, well, it feels good. I'm not technically over the finish line yet, so,
Okay.
but it will feel good. Yeah, it was a long and fun, but also at times stressful production, obviously because of COVID.
Uh,
Um, but it was a blast. So I always have fun making this show because I get to just basically hang out with a bunch of film lovers and talk
yeah.
about movies.
How was this experience different from the first season?
Well, we did a lot more international travel this season. So because
Yeah.
we're talking about Stalker and Cannibal Holocaust, we went to Rome for our Cannibal Holocaust episode
Yeah.
and went to Ukraine last year to Chernobyl and to Tallinn in Estonia. So that was a great experience, and but on top of that, international travel during the pandemic was also stressful, but it
Yeah.
was worth it for sure.
So for people that might not know, could you give a bit of an introduction to what Cursed Films is?
Yeah, I mean, we basically it's a show about the legends surrounding notoriously troubled film productions, and in some cases there are people who believe that there could be some sort of supernatural reasoning for these troubles that were experienced on these film sets. In other cases, it's that sort of situation where everything is going wrong and you can't help but think to yourself, it feels like this is cursed. You know, this production is cursed. So we basically are looking at these stories and just talking to the people who were there during these productions, and also trying to figure out why people are so interested in retelling these stories.
Before we get into some of the new films for the new season, I was wondering for Cursed Films 1, was there any was there the most controversial? Like were there any controversial standouts of all of the films covered?
I mean, the Twilight Zone episode is the heaviest, so that's definitely one that, you know, for a lot of people was maybe a shock, and especially people who didn't know anything about the making of the Twilight Zone. I should say specifically Twilight Zone, the movie. So that one for sure. And you know, the first season, the way in which the first season differs from season two is the first season was really an exploration into why we believe these things at all. You know, looking at magical thinking and coincidence, and the way in which we're programmed to look for connections, and why do we do that? And so there was a bit of an overarching investigation into that. And I feel like we dealt with that in season one. So for Curse Films 2, it really is almost like five individual documentaries about the making of these five films. And where season one, we always said it was about the rational versus the irrational. In this season, I've always thought of it as the real versus the unreal. So it deals a lot with not just films that blur the line. You know, part of like Cannibal Holocaust is a movie that's notorious for blurring that line and sort of playing with the contract with the audience in regards to what they're looking at and whether or not something is real. If they're looking at an animal being killed on screen, what else was killed on screen, you know?
Mhm.
And I think that can kind of be applied to the legends surrounding these films as well. Where does the truth begin and the legend end?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So yeah, it's follows a similar path as the first season, but the overall concern is specific to the making of each film.
are you superstitious? Do you believe in the supernatural at all? Like, which X-Files character are you?
I've only seen 2 episodes. I'm currently rewatching ER.
Oh
I'm on
wow.
season 13 of 15, and I
Yeah.
plan to go to the X Files after ER.
Cool.
So I can answer that after I get through those seasons. But I would say, is it? And I always say Mulder and Scully
You
instead
got
of.
it. I think you got
Is
it. But
uh,
basically, one believes and one doesn't, and I'm
I'm the David
wondering.
Duchovny. David Duchovny.
Uh-huh.
I think
The one that
in
believes,
that.
I think.
Oh no,
Yeah.
I'm the other one.
Okay, so you're. Yeah, it was
I don't believe.
you
I will
don't
say
believe.
that's the
Okay.
easiest way to just lay it on the table.
All
But I will
right.
say, I after doing the first season, I feel like maybe in some cases I'm a little more agnostic. You know, I don't believe in the supernatural, but I'm also I think not as quick to try to just apply an answer to something that seems unanswerable. You know, if there's some strange series of coincidences that feel otherworldly, there is there is an urge to just sort of draw a line through it and say, no, you can just explain it this way. But sometimes I feel that like that's just reductive and it just maybe a little closed minded, even if you don't believe in the supernatural. So
Mhm.
I try to just have more of an open mind, I suppose.
What's your relationship with horror outside of this series? Are you a big fan?
Yeah, yeah. I grew up watching a lot of horror films. I would say the formative years of my life, young life, were spent watching John Carpenter movies, and
Yeah.
which is funny because now it feels like a bit of an obvious answer, John Carpenter, but at the time, just watching those movies and recognizing the same font, the same music, the same actors, the compositions. It was really for me the first time I think where I recognized that there was an author behind these films,
Mhm.
and I could see that popping up whenever my parents would happen to rent one of his movies. So yeah, horror has been a big influence on me, and so has documentary.
Mhm.
And it's really those two worlds colliding in this show, pulling all of my horror fandom and all of my documentary fandom together to create a show that's more true documentary than scripted reality or like a Ancient Aliens or E True Hollywood Story. Like
Yeah.
we're trying to tell honest, real stories via the experiences of the people who were there.
Just before we dive into the content of the series, I'm wondering, was there ever a scary movie that really messed you up as a kid? Was there ever that one that sort of did it?
Yeah, I mean, John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness
Oh,
scared me when I was a kid, but I
okay.
think the one that kind of affected me the most wasn't a horror film. It was The Day After, the TV movie by
Mhm.
Nicholas Meyer about the nuclear holocaust. So
Yeah.
seeing that as a kid, and I remember at the time where I grew up, they still had air raid sirens in some of the schools, like on the playgrounds, and would test them here and
Oof.
there. So whenever I heard that, I would freak out and think that we were about to be bombed into the Stone Age. So,
There's nothing
uh,
scarier than that.
yeah, yeah. So, but Prince of Darkness on the horror side for sure.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the first episode of Cursed Films 2 is the first time that you feature a movie that's not a horror movie, and you have The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
What was it like picking that? Was that an obvious choice, or did you have to? Where did that come from?
It was an obvious choice. And also it's weird with like genre definitions, defining a genre. Like Wizard of Oz, I almost feel it's more of a horror movie than The Crow. Like it for a lot of people, I think is their first experience with being terrified by a character or a creature on screen with the Wicked Witch and the
Mhm.
flying monkeys, And in my case as a kid, another thing that terrified me was the tornado at the beginning of the film. So I think it does have, it's at the very least horror adjacent. And if anyone's been to Salem, they really lean into the witch and horror elements of the Wizard of Oz in all of their gift shops.
Yeah.
So it was an obvious choice in terms of it being a film that a lot of people talk about being cursed or the production being troubled or all of the stories connected to the making of the film. Maybe not as obvious in regards to the idea of like applying to this series this rule that it has to be all horror films. And I think that it, you know, breaks that rule a little bit, and probably Stalker breaks that rule more than The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
But even if the film itself isn't a horror film, sometimes the stories about the making of the films are horrific. So
Yeah.
I feel like it kind of falls in line.
It has one of the most horrific behind the scenes, I guess, myths that you tackle straight on, which is a background actor potentially committing suicide on set. From the episode, it seems like you didn't necessarily have a clear-cut answer at the end of the day if it happened or if it didn't. Or do you feel like you did get a definitive answer to what really went on?
It's a tricky thing with the show because I I think definitively it didn't happen, but the show isn't necessarily attempting to give evidence as to whether or not this did or didn't happen. The show is interested in talking to people who think it did and who think it didn't, and
Mhm.
watching them, you know, the contrast between those two perspectives.
Yeah.
And it's more about those people's fascination with it than it is about attempting to work with them alongside them in investigating, you know, what really happened here.
Mhm.
I mean, for me, that story is interesting because I think because it seems obvious that it didn't happen. You know, like the fact that people are still telling that story and perpetuating that myth, I think speaks to the power of a dark story at the core of a film that is considered to be, you know, this fantastic family oriented picture that everyone would watch every year and sit down, and the idea that hidden somewhere in the background is someone who committed suicide. The
Mhm.
contrast of those two things, I think, is what gives that story its life and perpetuates it. But I don't think it happened.
Why do you think people want to believe that it happened and seem not dissuadable?
I think so. That one is it's a weird one because it's you know, we often deal with stories about people, you know, passing away in an untimely and tragic way, and it makes sense for people to attempt to apply some grander conspiracy to that because the idea of someone just being here one minute and gone the next is hard to deal with. With this story, I think it really just gets at the idea of people, some people liking, they like being at the center of their own story. So they are the ones that have discovered this hidden truth and are bringing it to the masses to convince them that I've discovered within this film is this person that hung themselves. And on top of that, there it speaks. I think it speaks to the way in which things have changed in terms of how information and you know, fake news and things like that are processed online. Because a big part of the reason that story is still around is because someone made a YouTube video with a doctored hanging person in the background. So it completely confused the whole story, and people can now point to evidence on YouTube that supports the claim. And it just makes me think that, you know, years ago we had keyboarding classes in school, maybe we don't need keyboarding anymore. We need like internet literacy classes where
Uh-huh.
people are taught how to decipher the truth from a lie, especially on YouTube, because I know a lot of people have fallen victim to things that put them down a really strange dark path
Yes.
because they assume everything is real on the internet.
Yes. Yes. That algorithm is really out to get people.
Yeah.
Are there any films that were off the table that you sort of weren't able to consider, maybe because they were too controversial?
Um, Not because they were too controversial. I mean, I think usually the conversation is, does this fit within the season? Like we wouldn't want to do 5 episodes that are all about a haunted house movie. It would feel
Mhm.
like it's just repetitive. And so the films have to be kind of different. The stories have to be different. The tones, I think it's very important for the tone to be different because we start with The Wizard of Oz and end with Cannibal Holocaust. And those films could not be any more different, even though there are some weird crossovers in some of the stories. But I think what kind of excites me about the show is that within our season, those 2 episodes tonally are pretty far apart, but the intent and the style and like it still feels like the same series.
Mhm.
It's just really allowing the interview subjects to dictate where the show goes and the tone of that episode.
How, if at all, did your life change after the release of the first season?
Um, I mean, other than like not really interesting things like moving and stuff like that, not
Yeah.
too much. But I mean, there have been people that have talked about making a show about cursed films and of course, did we ever feel like our production was cursed? And I guess in one way, my life changed, and not necessarily having to do with the show, but 2 months before it came out, my dad died of lung cancer after like a very quick 2 month, experience with that. And after that, I lost an uncle, and then I lost my cat, and my producer lost his dad of the same cancer a year later. We lost one of our subjects at a young age in our stalker episode. There's just been a lot of, and then the pandemic. There's been a lot of dark stuff that has kind of happened since the first season. I don't think it's connected to making the show, but it
Uh-huh.
it, it does it does give me like I guess a front seat perspective on how people could look at everything surrounding a production and think, that's at the very least weird. And how it makes me wonder like how if the like impetus of all of this is this show, and it's released and then the bubble expands in terms of like it being out in the universe, how long do I have to connect all of these things back to the making of this show? Like, am I now just forever going to be like, well, you know, if I get cancer like 20 years from now, well, I did make cursed films back. So it just is interesting. Like, it really does make you want to consider something larger at hand, like just kind of making all of these decisions.
Interesting. I saw in the credits for the second season that Weyes Blood has provided music for the show.
Yeah.
Um, did you select the artist for that? How did they become involved?
Yeah, we were talking to her about, we had started talking to her about acting in something, another project. And through those conversations, once we started working on Cursed Films too, we needed a composer. And uh, Justin Small and Ohad Benchitrit did the first season, and they were great. And I loved that music, but I thought it'd be interesting to work with someone new. Um, and we went to Natalie and just asked her if she would be interested, and she's a big movie fan, so
Mhm.
she was uh, she was interested because she also wants to get into film composing. So
Cool.
it made sense, and it was just a really great connection there.
I'm a big fan of hers, and it was cool to see her in the credits for this.
Yeah.
So, do you have any spooky recommendations for Dread Central that you've been watching, or maybe that you're just a big fan of that you could recommend to our audience?
Spooky recommendations. I mean, I'm actually finishing the Cannibal Holocaust episode as I'm doing these interviews,
Uh-huh.
and while I would never recommend Cannibal Holocaust blindly for people,
Mhm.
um, although I think we'll get into the episode, the some of the value of that film versus the things that are abhorrent. But there is a section where we talk about found footage movies, and the one movie that comes up is the McPherson tapes, which is found footage. It's a found footage kind of horror science fiction film. I think it was from the early 90s, and it's basically a kid's birthday party shot on VHS, and during the party an alien ship lands, and the family is terrorized by an extraterrestrial that's walking around the house, getting on the roof, and it's just a very, it's kind of cheesy, but it's also weirdly unsettling.
Uh-huh.
Which you can get that through Vinegar Syndrome, and uh, and then I just got Communion through Shout Factory. I guess it's technically a Scream Factory release, but the Alien, another Alien movie starring Christopher Walken, which is uh, it's creepy at times, but also absolutely insane. Christopher Walken is at like peak Walken in in that
And that's
movie.
saying
So
something. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I was wondering if there anything that you learned brand new while making season two that you weren't already sort of familiar with before your research began? Was there anything that surprised you?
Yeah, everything having to do with Victoria Vetri in our Rosemary's Baby episode. So, without giving too much of it away, this is just she was in Rosemary's Baby. She played Terry, and she actually went by the name Angela Dorian when she was acting in that film.
Yeah.
But she just had a really interesting story post Rosemary's Baby that went into some directions that weren't expected. And it was one of those situations where, and these are always the fun situations where like you meet somebody, interview them, hear their story, and then they either recommend you talk to someone else or it inspires you to say, well, we got to talk to this person that they mentioned. And it led us down a path of trying to find, in this case, her ex-husband. That's part of the story.
Mhm.
So my producer was knocking on doors based off of a name search and previous addresses, and it was just like in the field trying to pull this thing together. And that to me is one of the better stories in the series. And in the same episode, Julian Wasser, who's a photojournalist who was brought up to Cielo Drive by Roman Polanski to take pictures at the crime scene, the Manson murder crime scene.
Uh-huh.
There's an interesting story there as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, before I let you go, I was wondering, could you tell us what's next for you after Cursed Films?
Well, we are. I will say one thing. My first documentary feature, Beauty Day, which is about kind of like a proto Jackass. The first before Jackass and Tom Green, there was this guy named Ralph Zavadil who did a show called the Captain Video Show on cable access in Southern Ontario, up here in Canada.
That's where I am.
And are you in Toronto?
I am, yeah. Where are you?
Okay, Toronto.
Okay, cool. Oh, wow.
So he did a show for McLean Hunter Cable Access, and it was just him doing weird stunts and skits, and I that was my first feature documentary about him and his life, and it is coming out on Blu-ray via Vinegar Syndrome and their partner label Circle Collective. So
Cool.
that is it's available for pre-order right now, And in terms of other projects, we're trying to get a documentary about John Teeter, who was a supposed time traveler who posted online in the early 2000s.
Mhm.
We're working on getting that going. We've been kind of lining everything up for that project for the last couple of years, and hoping that this year we can finally get into production on it.
Well, congrats. This is a
And
super
I
interesting
should I
conversation.
should mention also, I co-host a podcast called the Film Junk Podcast, which is
Oh,
a movie podcast. So you can listen to me there. This monotone voice over there.
perfect for podcasts.
Yeah.
Awesome. It was really great meeting you, and I can't wait to check out the rest of the second season.